Good day. My name is Benjamin Herzberg. I'm the program lead for the Private Sector Engagement for Good Governance program at the World Bank Institute. And I'm here to talk to you about the basics of monitoring and evaluation for public-private dialogue. This video is part of a series we're doing to try to bring more content online and spread the wealth of the knowledge that we've accumulated over time on supporting relatively high number of public-private dialogue initiatives around the world. And this content I will be delivering, it's the result of a collective thinking. I want to thank particularly the people mentioned on this slide. Frans van Gerven, who came up with an initial framework in 2006. Malcolm Toland, who conducted some evaluation in 2009 and helped us refine the methodology. Uriel Levy, who is another World Bank consultant who helped us develop a tool called the Reform Process Table in the context of an evaluation in Cambodia, Vietnam and Laos. And Jackie Coolidge, who is now retired. She was a senior private sector development specialist or lead private sector development specialist in the World Bank Group. And she had developed some fantastic tools that we call the back of the envelope tools to do some very rapid cost-benefit analysis in terms of some business enabling environment reforms, which I'll be showing you at the end of this video. So today we're going to have a video which is slightly more interactive than some of the others we've done. There is a number of exercises. We will give the exercises for you to download at the bottom of this video, and we'll try to, you'll be able to pause it to work on those things together, either yourself or with colleagues that you're watching this video with, since we hope it's a collective exercise. So the first thing you have to think about when you're talking about measuring results in a public-private dialogue initiative is, if you're involved today in a public-private dialogue initiative, how do you do it? What do you do in your own public-private dialogue? You know, people do lots of things. They decide not to measure anything. They measure the big results. They count the number of reforms. They look at the when you have a cluster of for a particular sector, a cluster of companies working together in a public-private fashion and in a private-private fashion sometime only. They decide to measure. You know, like the productivity, for instance. Some others, you know, you have so many measures you can use. And so there's a variety of things around the world. And what we're going to try to look here is, what are some tools that we can use? But think first about how do you measure things when you perform some task? And how do you measure things when you perform a public-private dialogue task? Now, I want to give you a general idea about what we call the logical framework, because it's pretty essential. It's some kind of the basis of monitoring and evaluation. And the logical framework is a process where you have goals that you want to achieve, and with those specific, general goals, you have specific objectives, and following those specific objectives, you're going to have a number of activities you're going to conduct that are input into the project. Then from that, you're going to get outputs. From those outputs, some outcomes are going to happen. And because of those outcomes, you will have some impacts. So from your goals to impact, we call this a logical framework, a series of steps that take place. You can see that when we talk about monitoring, we're monitoring what's happening between the when you do activities and the kind of outputs, a little bit of the outcomes. But when you're looking at the evaluation, you're looking at the outcomes and the impact. Well, the question, of course, is what is all those things? What is an output versus an outcome? What is an outcome versus an impact, and so on? So I want to give you some examples. When you're talking about an input into an activity, like the people who are working in it is an output, the financial resources, if you do training. On the right side, I put some example on the business environment, but we could use a different type of sectors. But training for officials, awareness events for stakeholders, mapping exercise, these are an input. It's something that you do. And what is it?
It's activities. Input is what get in the factory, and then the different activities it's this.
We call it input or activity. So,
Okay.
okay? John, what are we going to do? I want to go back to where I stopped.
I thought that they're going to edit that afterwards if they want to cut it and splice it right there.
Okay, so who is going to edit it?
Chris Valdez are the people from the communication.
You sure they're doing that?
They have, one of the two team, I'm discussing with them now.
Okay. Please don't interrupt in the middle because it's too hard to do it. Okay, let's carry on then. So what does that mean concretely? Well, let's take a list of potential indicators so you get a more precise idea of what those things are. Let's start with the input you have into the projects. You can also call them activities. What are those activities that you're measuring? Well, for instance, you do a mapping exercise, or you train people, or you organize a workshop, or you create a paper, or you create a brochure. These are all inputs and activities. Typical examples you're going to have anywhere is like human resources, financial resources you put into it. These are all things you put into the effort, and you create something with it. That's inputs. Now, outputs. Outputs are the... I'm going to redo this because I was confused here. Okay. So what does that mean concretely in terms of indicators? Because when you talk about a logical framework, we really have to make the difference between the different things like output, inputs, and so on and so forth. So inputs are what is going into, what do you put, what are the ingredients that you're going to use to produce something. So for instance, you might have a mapping exercise or a survey that's going to be able to help you create survey results that you're going to publish. So the survey itself is going to be an input, and the output is going to be the survey results. So usually the typical example we have in terms of input are human resources, financial resources, material resources, training, and so on. These go into it. Then what you get out of it. On the right side, I use business environment example, but you could use a different sector. For instance, an output, products, recommendation, a plan, studies, reports, legislation is drafted, you have an inspection report that was written, you have training for stakeholders, a draft of a new law, a press release. All those things are outputs. They didn't do any change yet, they just are there. And so you've outputted them. By themselves, what they can possibly create is an outcome. And the outcome is a change in knowledge or on the behavior of people, improved practices, increased services. A legislation is passed, for instance. First, you did some research, that was the input. You drafted a legislation, that was the output. The legislation has been passed, that is an outcome. And this eventually translates into an impact. For instance, it could be increased sales, increased employment, increased profitability, increased investments, increased formalization, increased exports. This is what you wanted to achieve at the beginning when you had the goal in mind. So you had the goal, you decided to focus on specific objectives, conducted a number of activities. Those activities resulted into an output, the output resulted into an outcome, and the outcome resulted into an impact. So the question then is, how do you select indicators that work for your project? That's a very complicated answer, of course. And often people tend to select indicators for every new project they do, and they select new indicators. And one of the things we recommend is try to get simple into the indicators that you select, because like that you'll be able to compare projects with each other and see if they work, if the type of outputs you've done have led to an outcome, and if the outcome have led to an impact or not. So the more you can standardize things, if you have a variety of projects, for instance, a variety of reforms that you're running, is good. Of course, you will have some very reform-specific indicators that will exist, but you will also have some common ones. So usually we talk about two kinds of indicators that you can have. You can have indicators that are smart and indicators that are spiced. These are acronyms. For performance information, you want SMART indicators. SMARTs are the initials, or specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-bound. So specific indicators, they are going to be very specific to that project, and they are going to reflect the change from before to after and assess the performance. They're going to be measurable, meaning that they're going to be objective data you're going to have. You can actually get that data, you can collect it, and you can compare it across the projects to allow for some change to be compared. It has to be attainable, meaning that you need to be there are some ideas that are great, but you don't have the time, you don't have the money to collect this information. So it needs to be somewhat reasonable in terms of indicators that you can actually get. You have enough statistics information, you have enough time to collect it, you have enough money to analyze it. Of course, it needs to be relevant to that particular project. And time-bound, it needs to describe a change in the time frame that you were talking about. So these are pretty precise indicators. We call them SMART indicators. They measure a change in something specific for a particular project in a particular time. You can also have spiced indicator, and we call those the indicators that are somewhat subjective, because there are a lot of things when you're talking about change of behavior, change of processes, which are difficult to measure in a very precise way, and you have to measure the perception of change, the things that are a little bit more subjective. And so what are spiced indicators? Well, the S stands for subjective, that each contributor will have a specific position or experience, and they're going to have unique insights, and they're going to be able to give that insights to an evaluator and say, this is my opinion, this is... So you have a series of anecdotal things, but altogether an evaluator might be using that to kind of form a general opinion of something that worked or something that didn't work, and why. They are participatory, that's what the P stands for. Participatory because they are developed together with those who are involved in being assessed by the results of this reform, in a way. So that the ultimate beneficiaries are involved in the definition of those indicators often, and that's why it's like participatory process. You just don't come in and say, hey, this is how I'm going to measure you. You have to make sure that those subjective indicators are done in a participatory fashion. They're interpretable. That's why the I stands for. And I mean that in a way that, you know, they have to be explained. They have to be contextualized. They are not just like, hey, this is the it's not like, you're not talking about an indicator like the amount of kilometer per liter that the car will go. You know, you can compare that. You can say this car is doing, 17 miles per gallon, and this one is doing 18 miles per gallon. But if you're saying this one is more comfortable than that one, you're going into spice indicator, because what is comfort, and in the context of what road did you experience that comfort? So all those things are important into the interpretation. They also have to be cross-checked, because you can't just, that's what the C stands for. It's just not like you need to make it valid, because otherwise, if you don't do this regularly with a variety of people, you get too subjective of an information. So this information, we grant that it's subjective, but it has to be somewhat cross-checked to make sure that things make sense. It It has to be empowering. That's what the E stands for. Empowering because those indicators have to give a sense to the groups and individuals that are affected by the situation, that these indicators are somewhat meaningful to them. And it means something to them, and it reflects a change in their particular situation. So a feeling, a change of appreciation, feeling of happiness. This is a subjective impression that's empowering as well, because people feel, oh, we feel more happy now than before. And they have to be disaggregated, meaning that you can't just concentrate on one group of stakeholders. You have to go on the fine details. What about the men and women to have gender discrepancies? What about the large businesses and the small businesses, the exporting businesses and the one that produce locally and sell locally? What about foreign investment versus local investment? What about this kind of politicians versus this kind of people in the administration? You got to look at all those factors and make sure that those indicators, they reflect a variety of views. So these are the SPICE indicators. Two kinds of indicators. The SMART one, very sharp, number-based. The other one are the SPICed one, are subjective, and they try to give an impression of what happened. And they're both legitimate. These are some example of more SMART indicators where you could put a list of them. Example of outputs, this is something that we've used when the World Bank Group delivers technical assistance. For instance, number of media appearances. So this project, so many times it came up in the press. Or number of reports like assessment, survey, or manual that were completed. This is an output. We did a report. Often people are saying, oh, we did this, that. Well, that's not enough. What's the outcome that came out of it? Well, the outcome can be, these are the number of entities that implemented the recommended changes. So we did a plan, an action plan for this agency, and this agency decided to implement the recommendations. So if a public-private dialogue says, we recommended the small medium enterprise development agencies to have such and such services, and eventually they did it, well, you can say it's an outcome. This happened. It can be the number of reforms resulting from the technical advisory that was given, and it can be measured. In that case here, an example of the doing business indicator that can be used as a measurement. Or number of investor inquiries in a targeted sector. If you were working to improve the attractiveness of a particular sector in a country for investors, and the public-private dialogue took a view of trying to do some promotion material about that sector, and then you measure how many investor inquiries existed before and how many investor inquiries exist after this program. That's an output. How does that translate into jobs or investments? Well, that's a question of impact. You count number of formal jobs, number of aggregate private sector savings. This is a measure that we use often because it can be measured as to, before a process, the private sector had to do some red tape, for instance, and had to spend money into putting time and money into administrative processes, and now they don't have to do it, so that's a saving to the private sector. Could be the value of investment or financing, or the value of funds released in terms of an alternative dispute resolution program. This is just to give you a snapshots of some of the SMART indicators that people use in the context of a World Bank advisory services, but you might have some of those used in a public-private dialogue as well, and we're going to see how we can try to tailor those eventually.